Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings and thank you for watching this short historical film about our local area. My name is Dale Bradley, I'm a filmmaker and I've been a local Whitford resident for over 25 years. This is the first in a series of short films telling our local stories and telling them primarily for our local Whitford audience. In this film, I'll introduce you to the very first European settlers to the area we now call Whitford. The brothers William and George Trice and William's wife, Margaret. Are those poplar trees? It's interesting if they are. I'm standing in what is possibly the most famous part of Whitford today, perhaps second only to our infamous Whitford landfill. This is Airlie's Gardens and Wetlands, a private garden created by Beverly McConnell and her late husband Malcolm, and recognised officially as a garden of international significance. We could spend a whole episode telling the story of this wonderful Whitford treasure, and perhaps we'll get around to that one day. But today, our story is about this land. So if those are poplar trees, it's very interesting because this is the location that the Trice Brothers chose. And they called it Poplar Farm.
Maori, of course, arrived here over 900 years ago. And the Auckland region was a favoured area because there was plenty of food available.
Local historian Alan LaRoche rightly reminds us that the very first immigrants were Māori. Many lived here in the very ancient Umapuia marae. Their history includes tales of the arrival in the Turanga Creek of the Tainui Waka around the year 1300. This gave rise to the name of the creek, which means anchorage.
Had been intended that there would have been a mission station in the area significantly earlier, but it was a very disrupted part of the country following the Ngāpuhi raids of the late 1820s, and most of the traditional Māori tribes had evacuated for safety reasons.
The Trice Brothers arrived in Wellington in 1841. Possibly on one of Wakefield's New Zealand company ships. They'd heard about Auckland, the recently designated capital of New Zealand, and decided to take a coastal sailing ship north to investigate.
Yeah, we got to Wellington and then we sailed up to Auckland. And we were told that up here the soil was very fertile and we wanted to get crops going and things if we could.
The land around Auckland at that stage was scrubby and very expensive, so they very prudently looked elsewhere.
This is the northwest boundary of Whitford. There's Sandspit on the Howick side and Broomfields Point on this side of the Mongamongaroa Gorge. William, Elizabeth and George Trice spent 3 years commuting between a boarding house in Auckland and a tent here in the Mongamongaroa.
They came out and camped at the Mongamongaroa area for a little while, and in 1843 when the land was surveyed they knew that that was where they wanted to stay, so they purchased 600 acres and set up Poplar Farm.
It's likely that they camped close to this spot on Broomfields Point. This was an important landmark as Maori travelled a track from Umapuia Marae and Maraitai right through to Cockle Bay and to the Tamaki Estuary. They crossed this estuary in Mongamongaroa when the tide was low, just like this. And it's here that the Trices established a good relationship with local iwi.
A lovely Maori chief took us across to the other estuary, and we had a look at land there, and it was seemed to be very good land. And
in the meantime they had already planted poplar trees, so they were fairly sure of their assertion that they'd get the land that they wanted.
And so we put a mark on it even though it wasn't ours. And lucky enough we got it, 600 acres, and we called it Poplar Farm.
We look back at the living conditions of these early pioneers. and have difficulty grasping the harshness of their lives. But, contrary to our natural assumption, these settlers considered conditions in New Zealand to be paradise in comparison to what they'd left behind.
You've got to understand that settlers had come along with very little preparation for the life that lay ahead of them. They were very conscious of what they were leaving and determined to leave behind them a world of interfering masters and of constant challenges.
It was going to be a better life, wasn't it? Hey? Living in Kent at that time, the harvests and the bad climate and the bloody so-called industrial revolution destroyed us.
The Fencibles were, when they came out, had to be over the age of 40 and under the age of 60, and there are records of the Fencibles in New Zealand living longer than Fencibles who remained in the UK. And some of them, when they came here, they had better nutrition, the lifestyle was better, it was a better climate to live in, and so they picked up and started a new life and often had second families.
But we noticed that the Maori and their whores and things were made from raupo, which is like a flax.
We had a raupo whore, which they built for themselves, while their homestead, Poplar Farm homestead, was being built.
So I'd like to see an example there, but I have to admit ours was much better and bigger. And Margaret and George, and so we needed at least 2 rooms, and we got the frames for the door and the 2 windows were sent down from Auckland.
Fire was, of course, the great threat.
And the lovely Maori woman, they wove flax mats for the floor, and we had a chimney. We had to be very careful with fires, of course, with everything being so tinder dry.
And they were warm in winter and hot in summer. The roofs also leaked and they attracted vermin, so you didn't want to have, you had to have sheets under the eaves in case something dropped on you at night. But it was extremely difficult for them because the land had to be cleared and they had to have an income fairly quickly. So they did 2 things. They started clearing the wood and chopping that into firewood, bagging it and sending it into Auckland, which gave them land to be able to plant for crops, because Auckland was a growing militia and a growing population, was hungry, and they needed firewood for cooking, and they needed food for eating.
We did grow some potatoes back in Kent and hops and things, so we thought we'd try it. And then of course the military were quite big in that area up in Auckland and getting bigger and bigger, so we put forward a proposal to supply them with potatoes. And away it went. Not only them, but all the settlers who were coming in shiploads, and so we had a very good business. And I'm going to say our first major business, because we went on for many others, but the potatoes established us and founded us here, really. Yeah.
So that's where Poplar Farm was, right down there. When I started researching this project, I assumed the Trices chose Clifton Point because of its proximity to the Turanga Creek. But I was wrong. There are 3 important waterways in Whitford. The Mangamangaroa, popular throughout Auckland today because of its walking tracks. The Turanga Creek, leading up to the Whitford village, and the almost forgotten Waikopua. I've discovered that the Waikopua was the big attraction to the Trice Brothers because that's where all the action was happening in the 1840s. You're probably aware of the new subdivision at the top of Siberia Hill called Waikopua Maya Rise. I used to live on another part of this hill, looking down on the Waikopua, but I had no idea how important this waterway was in the mid-19th century. You'll be as surprised as I was to discover that early Whitford settlers started to build their township here. Plans were drawn up for the village, and the owner of the Royal Hotel in Howick, now called Shamrock Cottage, made plans to build the Waikopua pub. This cottage is the only remaining memory of that emerging village, and I'm told that there are the remains of an old rotting wharf down there among the mangroves. There was a time when the occupants of this homestead had a grand view of a growing settlement, a bustling shipping industry, and a thriving timber trade. The Trice Brothers saw an opportunity, and in the 1860s they purchased an additional 400 acres of Waikopua forest land and joined the booming Cody trade.
We were lucky. When we bought Poplar Farm, there was a saw pit before we got there, because we were surrounded acres of kauri, perfect for spas and things for the ships. As
the settlers came in, they realised that they could harvest some of the larger trees, particularly the kauri.
These green Whitford pastures were once part of a vast Waikopua forest. The Whitford forest of today, planted in the 1950s by Henderson and Pollard, extends over thousands of acres. But the native bush of the mid-1800s was much larger, covering the hills behind beachlands and maraetai with natives like Totra, Rimu, Matai, and of course, the very valuable kauri.
That once again successful. We logged it and took it down in the estuary and out to the ships. It was brought up onto the by hoist onto the ships and off to Auckland. This was the sawn planks once we'd done it in our saw pit. Yeah, well, George was a breeder of these bullocks, because we needed them to drag the logs out of the bush and the forest.
Extracting the massive logs from the bush was done by using a variety of methods. Bullocks were the machines of the day, along with a few simple rail systems. But the ancient Waikopua Dam provided the most dramatic method of them all.
The logging of the kauri finished here in the late 1930s, so that was really the end of the kauri logging era. When the stream was in flood was when they shut the gates in the dam. As you can see, it's only a small trickle at the moment. But when the gates were shut, it didn't take long in the winter to fill the dam, and the water would back up to half a mile. The logs would be fallen and dragged into the ponding area. The logs below the dam would also be rolled into the creek bed, and the dam gate would be tripped. The water would rush out of the dam, carrying the logs down to the main river.
And we could just take the logs out straight out on barges, and the barges were towed by steamship to Auckland, where the sawmills did it there. But of course we built our own sawmill well before that.
There are still many kauri here in the Waikopua, and further up the valley, where large native groves still stand, there are some old giant kauri trees that were bypassed by the bushmen of the 1800s. These specimens are protected by the owners of this standout property in Waikopua. It was developed by an early Whitford resident from the last century. The Mail family owned the Whitford IGA store. Their son, the late Kevin Mail, a successful member of the Auckland business community, created this incredible hideaway in the 1980s. It was his weekend retreat. In 1989, its most famous guest resident was the America's Cup sailor Dennis Conner. Today it's known as Lily's Garden and owned by Lily and her husband, who are dedicated to protecting the Waikopua heritage and forest. They've planted over 100,000 plants, creating a wonderful garden sanctuary to share with the community. The Waikopua was not just home to a booming forestry industry. Flax milling was another significant export trade that attracted settlers to this part of Whitford. Hundreds of years earlier, Maori had discovered that by scraping flax with a shell, they could produce a very useful fibre.
And I remember seeing it being dried. Auckland was particularly important for sailing ships. Sailing ships required an enormous number of ropes if their rigging needed replacing. So there was a big demand for good quality flax rope.
This is the family burial plot of an early settler who owned a thriving flax mill here in the Waikopua. His name? Richard Whitford. Some believe our village was named after him. He also ran the local Waikopua post office. This cemetery on Waikopua Road is another reminder that the early pioneers had plans to build a town here. This land was originally owned by the Trice Brothers, who sold it to other well-known pioneers, William and Elizabeth Broomfield. They donated this part of their land to the church to be used for a school and a cemetery. Call in sometime and connect with some of our local history, and while you're here, see if you can find the grave of one of our recent Prime Ministers. This is the entrance to the gold mine at the Gold Mine Experience in Thames, Coromandel. The Thames Gold Rush started during the last half of the 1860s and continued for 3 or 4 years. It was exactly what Auckland needed to pull out of the depression that was caused by the colonial troops being withdrawn and the capital being moved from Auckland to Wellington.
There was a reward for if you could find gold anywhere near Auckland, a reward of £500. A lot of money.
Business leaders, seeing the economic boom happening in the Coromandel, offered a £500 reward to anyone who could find gold in the Auckland area.
And we'd sent away some samples from an area just south of the Poplar farm, a place called Hog Hill. And we came back saying, yeah, there's possible, because, you know, the mountains come through, the ranges, I should say, and it sort of looked all very reasonable that we might find gold.
Once again, the Trice Brothers seized on the opportunity. Unlike the alluvial mining of the Otago Gold Rush, where the gold was mainly found in riverbeds, the Coromandel and Whitford gold was found embedded in quartz rock. The gold had to be extracted by crushing the rock in a large machine called a stamper battery. This working stamper battery is operated by volunteers in the Thames Gold Mine Experience. And this is a working model of a stamper, engineered by enthusiast Evan Lewis. There are many mine shafts dug into the hills around Whitford and Clevedon, but to my knowledge, the Trices were the only ones who invested in their own stamper mill.
It was not very successful. They built a couple of shafts. One was 25 metres, the other was about 18 metres, and they had channels between them. But really the amount of gold wasn't worth it. But they were quite serious with their intention in getting gold and trying to seek gold if it was there, because they bought a stamper battery and a crusher which remained on the site for a long, long time.
It's likely that the Trice's stamper battery was very much like this small one that was built in 1938 by Fred Sawyer here in Thames. What we do know is that the Trice battery was powered by horse. I imagine the horses moved around in circles driving the large machine, much the way a large water wheel would. The settlers called the hill behind me Hog Hill. We call it the Whitford landfill. And there's gold in them there hills. However, the cost of extracting it from the quartz is far too high to make it an economical mining proposition. But, true to form, it seems that this is another Trice endeavour that ended up a success. Historical records show that William Trice served on the very first Turanga Roads Board. And Hog Hill, where they dug their gold mine, ended up as the Whitford Quarry. So you join the dots.
And so I was able to get onto the roads board, and I sold myself my own rocks.
I think the Trice brothers were probably the original Kiwis who set up the mentality of number 8 fencing wire, because they could certainly do anything. They lent their hands to all sorts of things. And I think also it's important to realise that the people who did come out into the area, they needed to work collegially, they needed to cooperate. They couldn't afford to buy a large machine themselves, but if everybody chipped in they could, and then they would all share that machine, and generally that worked quite well, and the Trices were very instrumental in setting up that system.
They would work simultaneously together and all hand scything together, and then they would stop, and taking out a whetstone they would sharpen the blade of their scythe, and then they'd all start together again, and it was choreographed rather like a ballet.
Eventually Poplar Farm had its own forge, it had its own kitchen unit, it had hen houses all over the place. They had a brewery even, which is very important in those days, very thirsty days those were, and they were very enterprising, but I think they had a plan right from the get-go.
Well, we're doing very well, of course, with the spuds and the timber, but there were so many people arriving in Auckland and the surrounding areas, and we were talking to this fellow who had been a blacksmith back in Kent, and so we suggested we go into partnership, and we supplied horseshoes and all the things, implements that are needed, and hammers and stuff, and by God, we worked hard. And we had grapes and a winery and a flour mill. Yeah, we expanded a lot, and we still had the potatoes going, the barley, the hops, and the firewood, the curry logs still going, and so we were doing very well for ourselves, George and I. Yeah, not just good for us, but for everyone around us. Yeah, we wanted to help the community as well as ourselves.
The Trice brothers were not just very successful at building business ventures, they were committed community builders as well.
Well, we wanted to be part of the community and build the community up, because we loved where we were and the people, the settlers that were coming in, and we all got on well.
William and Margaret and George, who never married, are all buried here in the Howick All Saints Anglican Church rather than in the Waikopua Cemetery. That's quite fitting, because the Trices assisted Bishop Selwyn, who commissioned the design and build of this church with donations of timber and labour. And church records show that they also gave great support to Reverend Vicisimus Lush, the first vicar of this church.
And the churches have always struggled, and so, you know, we were a good family to tap on the shoulder if he needed a new roof or a bit of something or other.
The Trice name appears on many historical records, including the Whitford Hall Committee, juries, and of course the local church committee. And prior to there being a local church, they opened their home once a month to the Reverend Lush for an Anglican church service.
Reverend Lush came, and resident vicar in Howick, and he would travel out to the Waikopua and take services in the Trice's homestead, and he would walk over to Clevedon in the over the saddle at the head of Waikopua down to the little chapel in Clevedon.
The settlers, like the Trices, would invite their neighbours and any servants that they had to come in and attend the services, and hymn books and liturgical books would be handed out to the settlers, and any baby that was unbaptised would be promptly baptised.
And so we made them welcome, and the neighbours all came. Yeah, it was a very social, spiritual, I suppose, thing, you know, on a Sunday, yeah. Bishop Selwyn was very aware of that, and very kind, I suppose, but brought us a Norfolk pine, just a small one, and we planted it on the Poplar farm, and it took off. It's still looking very healthy today. We call it Bishop Selwyn's Norfolk pine.
And this is that Norfolk pine. You can see it easily as you drive down Clifton Road towards the most northern point of the Clifton Peninsula. There was a time when the Trice homestead stood in the shadow of this tree. But today, over 170 years later, it stands as a living monument to the very first European settlers in Whitford. The Trice Brothers. William Trice and his wife Elizabeth, and his brother George, who laid the foundations for economic prosperity and a healthy, thriving Whitford community.